With almost every solid free agent starting pitcher off the board already this offseason, it feels like the Orioles are going to have to turn to trades to upgrade their starting rotation. So today, we start a series looking into which guys on other teams could be available and how the Orioles could go get them. Today, we look at the Seattle Mariners, Marco Gonzales and Chris Flexen. One of them isn't going to make the Mariners rotation. Could that one end up in the Orioles rotation? We talk about how he, either Flexen or Gonzalez, could get to Baltimore. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Monday, December 19th, 2022. And welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we start our Orioles trade target series. We're going to be talking throughout the next few weeks of the offseason, looking at players on other teams, specifically starting pitchers who the Orioles could acquire this offseason. Because let's be honest, as I record here on Sunday afternoon, Nathan Eovaldi really the only free agent starting pitcher left out there that feels worth it for the Orioles to sign that could sit at the top of the rotation. Everybody else, I know they've been connected to Michael Wacha and Rich Hill over the past week, but they don't really do it for me, especially after they've already signed Kyle Gibson. They need more of a top line guy, and so it's probably going to have to come via trade. Now, Mike Elias has talked about the Orioles are ready to make a trade. They certainly have the prospects in a top 5 system in baseball to do it. Now it's just about finding the right suitor and finding the right pitcher that is available via trade. So today, let's start with the Seattle Mariners, because kind of the first rumors you heard this offseason about teams dealing starting pitching were the Mariners. It seemed like they were going to have an overload. They were going to go after free agent starting pitching. And two guys at the back end of their rotation, the veteran lefty Marco Gonzales and the right-hander Chris Flexen. Well, it looked like both of those guys might be available. Now, Gonzales was coming off a little bit of a rough season. Flexen was solid in 2022, but never stayed in the rotation all year. Kind of flipped between their 5-starter and then kind of the swingman relief role, but did still get some outs. Now, neither guy is a giant strikeout pitcher. Neither guy is an ace. But both guys, I think, would help the Orioles pitching staff if they acquired them. So we're going to talk to Ty Dane Gonzalez. He is the host of Locked On Mariners here on the Locked On Podcast Network, little Mariners Orioles crossover for the first time here on this pod. We'll talk about Gonzalez, what the O's would need to do to get him. We'll talk about Flexen, what the O's would need to do to get him, the differences in their contracts, the differences in potentially the deals, and why the Orioles might have to part with a guy like Ramón Urías to get that deal done. But that's all coming up right now with Ty Dane Gonzalez of Locked On Mariners. All right, so we welcome Ty Dane Gonzalez into the podcast. He is the host of Locked On Mariners here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And Ty, first of all, thank you so much for coming on the pod. First Mariners Orioles Locked On crossover going on here.
Yeah, appreciate it. Long time coming, I guess. It's should be fun. These two teams are in very similar spots right now.
Yeah, a couple teams that battled for a playoff spot last year. Of course, Seattle finally getting in, snapping the drought. The Orioles close, but not quite. And two teams whose fan bases, I think, are definitely disappointed, I would say, to different levels so far this offseason. Seattle's done a little bit more to add to their team than Baltimore has to this point, but to varying degrees. And so maybe, just maybe, a trade between these two sides could be a way that they could each improve going into 2023. So the reason we're kind of talking about this is because the Mariners seem to at least have a surplus of kind of back-end starting pitching that it was reported very early in the offseason that they may at least be listening to offers on. So first, to kind of set the stage, the two guys seem to be Marco Gonzales and Chris Flexen. What, at least from the Seattle perspective, is the level of, are they being shopped? Are they listening to offers? Kind of where do you see the viability of a trade happening this offseason?
I think at the start of the offseason, maybe it was true that they were being shopped, or at least Chris Flexen was being shopped. It kind of seemed like there was a time where that felt more imminent than it does now. But we've seen the way that this starting pitching market has developed, particularly in free agency, and just some of the ridiculous numbers that are being thrown out for guys that are, quite frankly, low end number 3, number 4 type starters, guys that are making $17-18 million a year. And then, I think it became clear to them because they really had interest in Kodai Senga at the start of all of this, at the start of the offseason. Jerry Dipoto outright said, we really like Senga. We're going to be in touch with him and his camp. But the more clear that it became that Senga wanted a bigger market, and by the looks of his contract, just clearly wanted to be a New York Met, I think the Mariners have possibly taken a step back here and gone, you know what? We have 4 above average starters and Robbie Ray and Logan Gilbert and George Kirby and Luis Castillo, and Marco Gonzales and Chris Flexen at the very least are solid number 5s to pair with those other 4 guys. And, last year they had remarkable health in the rotation as well. That's unlikely to continue this next season. So having that depth is unique. And you look at again, the rest of the market and what some of these guys are making. Chris Flexen for $8 million, Marco Gonzales for $6.5 million. Those are bargains right now, even with both of those guys coming off of down years.
So as Seattle hasn't really made the splash in free agency, what it sounds like is that it might be a little tougher to get either of these guys from the Mariners, at least at this point. So do you think there's still a chance at least one of them is dealt? And you think what the Mariners are asking for, if there are trade talks, is different at this point, 2 months later?
Yeah, so I that's really the question, right? For me personally, I think they have taken a step back, like I said, from the starting pitching market after they didn't land Senga, and just looking at some of the other contracts that guys are signing. I mean, maybe they still look at someone like a Nathan Eovaldi, or they go on the trade market. Maybe someone like JT Brubaker is available that they would be interested in and think that they can get more out of than, say, someone like Pittsburgh. But for the most part, yeah, I think they're looking at this market and they're going, well, why do we need to go upgrade? Is that actually worth the money? Is the extra win and a half, 2 wins that we're adding with that pitcher actually worth the cost of acquisition? Or does it benefit us to just have these guys around and figure it out, at least in spring training? Because here's the thing, the Mariners under Scott Servais and Jerry Dipoto have always preferred to have an 8-man bullpen. And I don't think that they necessarily, they did this last year, but they were also trying to trade Marco Gonzales at the trade deadline. Apparently they had a 3-team deal set up with the Yankees and Phillies that would have sent Marco to Philadelphia and Joey Gallo to Seattle. Apparently they had that lined up. They ended up making it work where Flexen went to the bullpen, but he hardly pitched. He was just mop-up duty. And I think that they would want more value out of all of their reliever spots than just a mop-up guy. So I'm not sure if they would actually waste one of those spots on Marco or Flexen, and it would likely be Flexen in this scenario. So maybe it just comes to a point where this gets pushed aside until spring training, where they figure out who wins the competition, and whoever doesn't ends up getting sent elsewhere. That's what I would think right now, because they also have some young prospects down in the farm system that are either major league ready or they're close to major league ready. Taylor Dollard, Emerson Hancock, Bryce Miller, Brian Wu, those guys are all going to factor in at some point over the course of the next season. So they also might want to open or leave the door open for those guys to get some innings as well. So, one way to accomplish that is to clear the way and trade one of these guys. So, but I think really, again, going back to the value standpoint, I know that I'm rambling, sorry, but to just go back to the value standpoint, I think that if they are going to trade one of these guys, they're going to have to get something that helps them this year back, because that's just more valuable to them than getting the contract off of the books.
So we will get back to our chat with Ty Dane Gonzalez of Locked On Mariners in just a second, talking about some potential O's and M's trades for starting pitching. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by BetOnline.net, which is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis this December. Now, the World Cup is over. I mean, what a final it was between Argentina and France. Congrats to Argentina on winning the World Cup on Sunday, but there's still plenty of sports going on. Of course, college football bowl season really gets into the swing of things this week. You got college basketball on every single day. And then, of course, you got the NBA with Christmas Day coming up, and the NFL. They're basically owning Christmas Eve and Christmas Day this year. And you can get all the lines, all the odds at BetOnline. Plus, you got the NHL out there and plenty of other action to place some wagers on. And if you love sports podcasts, well, you can even find those at BetOnline as well. They're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more at BetOnline, where the game starts. Yeah, and that's the thing with both of them. You mentioned each making, $8 and $6 million on a team that's trying to win. So they're not looking to shed that little amount of payroll, and they're not looking to flip them probably for prospects. I mean, they're looking to, I would think a deal like this would be a 1-for-1 swap potentially for another major leaguer, which would probably help both teams that are trying to compete. So kind of looking at Flexen, he's the guy who is a free agent after this year. So maybe a little less value with him. I know it was a 3.73 ERA last year. He threw just under 140 innings, some out of the bullpen, some in the rotation. It wasn't, high strikeout numbers. He was more of kind of an innings eater. Even when he was, starting every fifth day in 2021, that kind of seemed to be his solid role as well. So if it got to the point where, Marco Gonzales wins that role and you're looking at Chris Flexen, or even the other way around, Flexen wins the role and you look at Gonzalez, who, I believe it could be signed through 2025 with a club option. And, he's only making $6 or $7 million each of those years. If it was a 1-for-1 deal, where do the Mariners need that kind of help the most if they were to flip a starting pitcher for a different kind of, they're not going to get a star major leaguer, but a mid-level major leaguer to help the team?
Yeah, so right now they're looking for right-handed corner bats, so both corner infield and corner outfield. So Ramón Urías could be an option, and I was told about a year and a half ago that the Mariners did check in with the Orioles about infield options. So it's possible that Urias was one of those guys. Anthony Santander, and I know that this would not be a 1-for-1 type of deal. The Mariners would have to definitely include more in their package to acquire someone like Santander, but I think he's someone that the Mariners would be very interested in as well, especially having that switch-hitting handedness element as well. So those are the two guys that I really look at that I think make sense for the Mariners and don't necessarily derail the Orioles timeline either. I don't know how you feel about that, but what do you think about those guys? Either one of those guys here.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely both guys that would fit. Another guy that came to mind is Austin Hayes. Now his value is a little different because I think the Orioles still aren't sure if he is a starter or a fourth outfielder long-term. I mean, they were hoping he could be an everyday left fielder. The injury problem wasn't as bad this year, but I mean, it was an all-star first half and then a horrendous second half. So we just don't know what Austin Hayes is, but he still has a lot of control. Santander had a great year, power, middle of the lineup, but defensive versatility is way down. He's mostly a DH at this point who can play a little corner outfield, twice a week, basically. Right. And he's a free agent after 2024, so he's got 2 years. I think Urías is kind of the perfect fit here because something we'll touch on at the end is the Orioles just signed Adam Frazier, who is most likely going to play a good amount of second base for the O's. They've got Gunnar Henderson, who came up, lit the world on fire in September. He's either going to play shortstop or third base. And they have a guy in Jorge Mateo where the bat wasn't there, but he won the Fielding Bible Award at shortstop. So they've got that locked down. And Urías was probably going to be fighting with Frazier for at-bats at second base. The Orioles have another guy in Terrin Vavra who plays second and came up for the last 2 months last year. And the Orioles are littered with infield prospects in the high minors. So the Orioles' plan kind of this offseason was maybe they would go after one of the big four shortstops. They never really did. And then it was going to be, let's sign a mid-level left-handed bat, AKA they just did it, and Adam Frazier, and we'll kind of roll with the internal options. People have already talked about, we're recording here just a couple hours after the Adam Frazier signing, that signing could mean that the O's are ready to trade one of those other kind of infield depth guys to make those guys expendable to get some pitching. So I kind of look at a Ramón Urías as kind of the perfect fit. So here is where I counter. Marco Gonzales and Flexen have different values. Gonzalez has more years. He's a little bit cheaper as well, even next year. Gonzalez, I think, in the big leagues, maybe has a little bit better track record of success between the two guys. And, Flexen a couple years younger, but you could maybe argue Gonzalez could be the better long-term option. Would you think in terms of return for each of those guys, it would look different for Flexen versus Gonzalez?
I think their pros and cons end up balancing one another out. And really their ceilings at the end of the day are low end number fours at this point. At least just in my opinion. I mean, Marco is just a couple of years removed from being really good. Like in the COVID year, he was fantastic. But the last 2 years, he's a guy that he doesn't have overpowering stuff, so he needs to cherry pick around the corners, and the command just hasn't been there in order for him to do that efficiently and with consistency. There's too many times where he just catches too much of the plate and guys just rip the ball off of him. So for that, even over the court, even with having the club control, I don't think the club control really matters in this situation. Because Marco is owed $12 million next year. It's only $6.5 million this year, I believe $12 million next year, and then a $12 million club option, something like that. I don't think that's really like something that either a team views as valuable or not so valuable. I think they're just kind of indifferent on that. Flexen just being a 1-year guy he's a solid stopgap who a team and a pitching staff might think they can get more out of, because his slider last year was one of the best pitches in all of baseball, most effective pitches in baseball. He just didn't throw it a ton. So maybe a pitching staff looks at that and thinks, maybe I can turn this guy into lazy comp, but maybe, they think that like I can turn this guy into the next Ross Stripling, and get out of him what the Blue Jays got out of Stripling this past year. So again, yeah, I think the values just kind of even out here, and it's going to be interesting to see how desperate teams are to still add pitching and to add affordable pitching, considering where the market is at now, that we're basically in the mid-tier to bottom of the barrel of that market. So,
and it's interesting on the Orioles side, because it'll be interesting to see how desperate they get. You're talking about maybe the Mariners waiting it out for a competition in spring training between if they want to trade one of these guys.
Yeah.
For the Orioles, some of this is going to be about, what the likes of these kind of AAA level right now infielders look like in spring training as well, because they have guys in Jordan Westburg and Joey Ortiz who have never played in the bigs but are very close. And then they have guys like Jorge Mateo and Urías and Terrin Vavra who have played in the bigs but have not proven themselves yet. And so if you look through all this group and you realize, hey, with the addition of Adam Frazier and with some of our young guys, we just feel there's not going to be an everyday spot for Ramón Urías, who won a Gold Glove at third, was above league average as a bat, and hits the ball hard. Maybe that's a trade they could flip. I mean, it seems like if each team is kind of desperate for the other, maybe a March deal that is just a Ramón Urías for Marco Gonzales, could happen. I feel like that could happen depending on how they evaluate each of their spring training rosters.
How many years of club control does Urías have still?
Yeah, so I believe he would be signed through 2025.
Okay, so that lines up, but there's going to be more money going over to Baltimore, of course.
Right. So, for Ramón Urías also, there's still something to be unlocked there as well, which I think less so for Marco Gonzales. I think we kind of know who Marco Gonzales is at this point as a pitcher. And maybe there's a little bit more to be unlocked with Flexen, a little younger, and you mentioned the slider. The one thing with Urías is actually, scratch that. He signed through 2026, so he's even further. And the one thing is with Urías, he hits the ball really hard. He's in the top 50 of Major League Baseball in his hard hit percentage. The issue is his launch angle, and he just beats the ball into the ground. And every time he hits the ball in the air, he goes on these crazy hot streaks. You look at, I believe it was June this year for Ramón Urías, was just insane. Might have been July. It was just insane because he was lifting the ball finally. He was hitting homers. He was hitting extra base hits. And he doubled his launch angle this year, but it was still ground ball after ground ball. And so there's something to be unlocked there. And he does have, still a lot of control. So, I wonder, it could be the O's offer Urías for whichever of those two pitchers they find more valuable from Seattle for whatever reason, whether it's the years or it's the moldability of Flexen versus Gonzalez kind of being who he is. But in terms of Urías, he's in a weird spot. And that's why I think the Orioles have a chance of trading him, even if it's not with Seattle this offseason, because he has been good, not great. They keep trying to fix that approach, and it's getting marginally better, but not better quick enough because the guys behind him have higher ceilings and they're knocking on the door now. So the Orioles are almost kind of backed into a corner of, needing to deal him away. And when they do, they need to get major leaguers and not minor leaguers. And so I feel like that kind of lines up here.
Yeah, I think that's a good fit here. And Urias is someone that my co-host Colby is a big fan of. He's talked about him for the last year or so. So we're very familiar with Urias, and considering what Jerry Dipoto has said to the media, again, saying like we would like a right-handed corner infield bat to kind of rotate throughout the infield and through the DH. I think Urias is a really good fit for the M's. And like, if I'm Baltimore, I don't know. It's weird because, like, what are your guys' feelings on what your like ceiling is this year? Wild card, like, is that it? Because like I saw the stuff that they were saying about spending and all. Like I saw some quotes that didn't seem that great, So like, where are the Orioles right now?
They're not going to spend. They've shown it so far with not going and get starting pitching. They needed starting pitching, and they've added Kyle Gibson on a 1-year, $10 million deal. They needed a left-handed bat. They added Adam Frazier on a 1-year, $8 million deal so far. So I think they're going to make a couple of trades because of just the amount of prospect depth that they have, a top 5 system in baseball right now. They have a good young core coming together and a team that won 83 games, but I do think the ceiling is a wild card. Like, they're not going to win a division, especially being in the AL East right now. I mean, if the Red Sox get it together, you could potentially have 5 teams competing for the playoffs going into the year, which you can't say about a lot of divisions in Major League Baseball right now. So I think that hinders their ceiling. And the fact that they're not going to spend and add as much, I wouldn't be surprised they won 83 games again just because of the spot that they're in. So they're trying to win now, but kind of gingerly trying to win now.
So then going off of that, I mean, it really depends on how they feel about Flexen. Right? Do they feel that they can get more out of Flexen and at the very least be able to flip him at the deadline as a rental and get something nice for him in return? Or if it's really just like they view them both as the same, maybe it is Marco. But that is going to be, $12 million. If Marco has the year that he's had the last 2 years, that's a very expensive low end number 5.
Yeah.
Like, that's just what it is. Like, all due respect to Marco, but that's what he's been in the last couple of years. So that's also the risk that the Orioles would have to assume here. And that's why I think that probably if the Orioles do want Marco Gonzales and the Mariners want Ramón Urías out of this, the Mariners are probably going to have to include something else along with Marco.
And I could also see, even if it's Flexen on the other side too, the Orioles saying, just as some insurance for if his 1 year isn't good, or on the Gonzalez side, like if he's just who he is, just for some insurance, Mike Elias dips into that Seattle system and gets him to add a player. But maybe that makes a deal here.
And I don't think the Mariners are adverse to taking on some of the money here as well. I think they would take on some of the money for Marco. There was some talk about them potentially taking on some of the money had they traded him to Philly. So that maybe levels things out a little bit, but I don't know if I can see a 1-for-1 swap here with either of these pitchers just for Ramón Urías, though I don't think it would take a ton from Seattle either to chip in and finish that thing off.
Yeah. But I think, as we've talked, it could be about, waiting 3 months from now until these teams kind of figure out their rosters a little bit more. But Ty, before, we finish up, obviously the Orioles, just before recording this, they signed Adam Frazier, who spent the last year and a half in Seattle. And while he was definitely productive with Pittsburgh and somewhat with Seattle last year, he was arguably not that this year in 2022. And, it was kind of surprising from the outside to see him still in the postseason lineup, in that series against Houston. But I guess he was still one of the better options, at least to have in there with the experience. The O's bring him in. It's obviously a 1-year deal. It's not a lot of risk. It's $8 million. He may not even play every day if his bat doesn't come back to where it was in Pittsburgh. But just kind of as we finish, your general thoughts as someone who watched him every day for the last year and a half and what Adam Frazier is at this point in his career.
There's a reason Colton Wong is going to be the starting second baseman for the Seattle Mariners in 2023. So I'll just say that the thing about Frazier really is that his offense he just couldn't really get it going at the plate. He had one hot month in the middle of the season around the time when they had the 14-game win streak, and that was about it. He also has one of the greatest hits in Mariners history for the go-ahead double in the comeback game against the Blue Jays in the wild card round. So there's that, but that's about it. His defense also took a significant hit, which Adam Frazier before this season was known as basically an elite defender at second base and a solid enough glove in a corner outfield spot as well. And the corner outfield stuff was fine, more so towards the start of the season. He was getting starts out there, particularly in right field, and he was able to hold his own, and he should be able to hold his own at Camden as well if they need him to do that. But the second base defense took a pretty substantial dip for the most part. I think he's still favored fairly well in outs above average. I haven't checked in a while. But eye test wise, he just wasn't the same guy. He wasn't covering the same amount of ground. He was making some silly errors, stuff like that. So the key there is, especially now with the shift ban, or at least the ban of more than two, fielders on each side of the bag, that's going to be interesting to see on if he continues to regress or if he's able to figure some stuff out here. And I don't know if he was dealing with anything during the season or what have you, but the defense just wasn't there. But by all accounts, he seems like a great clubhouse guy. So, and he, because he's a slap hitter, we call him the Slapton. So you guys better take good care of the Slapton. And Godspeed, Slapton. Thank you for your service.
The hope is he looks like the hitter he did in Pittsburgh in the first half of the year in 2021. I have my doubts, and it seems like you do too, that will happen. But he is in an Orioles uniform, and hey, maybe another former Mariner could be in an O's uniform again. We know Jerry Dipoto loves to make trades. He's made them with the Orioles before, and we'll see if he does it again. But Ty, thank you so much for joining us for a little O's, M's crossover here, because each team has a need. Each team's trying to go to the playoffs, and we'll see if they maybe pull off a deal here at some point this offseason.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Connor. Appreciate it.
So our thanks again to Ty Dane Gonzalez, the host of Locked On Mariners here on the Locked On Podcast Network, for joining us to talk about potential trades the Orioles could make with the Mariners, whether it be for Marco Gonzales or Chris Flexen. And it really was an interesting conversation with Ty, because at the beginning of the offseason, it felt like the Mariners were going to fairly quickly trade one of those guys, because neither of them were really pitching incredibly well, but still had value and certainly are big league pitchers, but they just couldn't really fit them into the rotation. And the Mariners thought, hey, we're going to add, if not one, maybe two starting pitchers. But we've gotten to this point here in mid-December, and the Mariners kind of operated like the Orioles, where they certainly added to their offense. They got Teoscar Hernandez and they picked up Colton Wong, but they didn't really add to the rotation like they wanted to. And so now they realize they're going to need at least one of Flexen or Gonzalez. And the funny part is, if the Mariners don't add anyone else, they could end up keeping both guys, because I could see like Gonzalez becoming the 5-starter and then Flexen staying in kind of that bullpen swingman role. And, if anybody gets hurt, Flexen fills in that 5th spot in the rotation. Now, it's still possible they could trade them. And Ty talked about how, they might wait until spring training, kind of see who wins the 5 spot, maybe try to deal the other one. But what they're looking for is major league help. They're not looking for prospects from the Orioles system. They're looking for a guy who is a little younger, maybe not super proven, but can help their offense. That's why we kind of settled on Ramón Urías probably being the guy. They needed corner players, infield and outfield. Well, Urías just won the Gold Glove at third base. He's an above league average hitter, and he can certainly get better at the plate if he improves that launch angle. So maybe that's the deal to be made. And if it is a guy like Urías for, Flexen or Gonzalez 1-for-1, and they talked about, maybe the Mariners would have to throw in a prospect or two also to get that deal done, which, certainly doesn't bother me at all or anyone on the Orioles side. But I think it's a trade partner. Maybe not the best trade partner, because I think the Orioles would like a little more upside than Gonzalez or Flexen, especially Gonzalez. You kind of know what he is. He's a soft-tossing lefty who has struggled a little bit lately, but has had a good career. Flexen, you can, I think, bring more out of, maybe a higher upside, but he could also be bad. And again, neither of those guys are better than your 4th starter, probably. So the Orioles would probably aim a little higher, you would think, if there's a trade, but if they can't get those done, they could always run to the Mariners, come March and make a deal like that. And hope you liked that episode. We're going to have more like it here throughout the offseason in the next couple of weeks on this Orioles trade target series, specifically, again, looking at starting pitchers around the league that could be available via trade, and how the Orioles could potentially go get those guys to supplement this starting rotation. But as I did mention last week was the final week of the offseason of 5 podcasts per week. So starting this week, we are down to 3 episodes a week. The schedule right now, you should expect an episode, obviously today, and then Wednesday and Thursday of this week, you should expect an episode. Obviously, I'll let you know here on the pod if those things do change. And of course, if there's any breaking Orioles news later today, there will be a podcast in your ears on Tuesday morning. If the O's, do go make a trade, or, if they do sign Michael Wacha or Rich Hill, a couple of starting pitchers who they have been connected to over the past week. But until we return, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.